Let me see if the recording, yeah, it's on. So, welcome to the special Christmas edition of the NGN webinars. It's been a year since we started. And we're very pleased to have John here, who doesn't need any introduction. He's basically a fellow of every society you can think of: the Royal Society, ACM, British Computer Society, IET, Royal Academy of Engineering, the IEEE. Have I left out anything?
Probably, I can't remember.
The Turing, yeah, you're also a Turing fellow. Yeah. But go look him up on Wikipedia if you need to figure out all the rest. Over to you, John.
Okay, and I'm drinking this fine drink here, which comes from the Turing, which I stole from the fridge this morning, and I noticed it's very fine, you know, but it says tastefully light. So that's how you should take this talk, as tastefully light. It's not very technical. I have no idea why I gave Nishant this title, but somebody was hassling me to sort of say what I was going to talk about. So I said that, you know, there's the 12 days of Christmas and there's the Advent calendar and stuff. So I was thinking of some kind of Advent calendar. And then for some reason, I sort of decided it would be the 12 cephalopods of Christmas, because that's just sort of sufficiently weird that it, you know, you can't ascribe any meaning to it in any way. So I don't expect to see any meaning here. And then just for the etymology minded people, we were talking about this earlier, but cephalopod comes from the Greek words, you know, cephalopoda, which is means head, feet. So cephalos, your head, and poda, and you think of all these words like pteropod or monopod or whatever, which are feet. And then ton Christo genon, excuse my accent, Greek people, is Christmas in Greek. So that's the cephalopods of Christmas. And Christo, of course, is the name of Jesus Christ, which is comes from the Greek, not from Aramaic or whatever, as far as I know. I think it means blessed or anointed or something. Anyway, so that's what that Greek is there. And thanks to the Greek people for correcting my original title, which was wrong Greek. I wasn't even Greeklish. So this is 12 examples of cephalopods. And so the first example, so they're just examples and there's no real connection between them except for the running gag of there's something to do with a cephalopod or their name is. So the first example, and these are all to do with, you know, next generation networking or things that might be to do with next generation networking and computing. So I'll probably ramble a bit about how to make that relevant. So the first one is actually the acronym SQUID, which is a superconducting quantum interference device. I can't spell quantum. The cat exploded over my spelling checker. Anyway, yeah, so I'm actually busy putting together quantum data center proposals, which we didn't get funded, but we're thinking of re-proposing. So quantum data center is a really interesting idea, which is to combat the problem of quantum computers, which we don't have because nobody can make a quantum computer that scales, but they can make small quantum computers. So reliably somewhere in the range tens of qubits. And if you're not aware of what qubits are, and don't worry about it, just think of it as like Christmas tree decorations. And there are lots of different ways you can build qubits, but you can use two Josephson junctions and use them as a noise interference removing device. And the reason that's important is when you build lots of qubits, the way they work is through entanglement and superposition of states. So effectively, the state machine that is a quantum computer moves through a large number of states in parallel, where large is really large, just depends how many parallel states on each qubit and then how much entanglement you're on. The more you do that, the more you get noise, and the noise messes up the entanglement, it messes up the state. It's exactly analogous, or it is the same noise as, or worse noise as you get in classical computers, because classical computers are operating at quantum level, they're just not using superpositions of states in the same way. And the noise ends up dominating the system. But you can successfully build things that run, say, 12 qubits for many operations. And by the way, they're not really programmable. They're basically circuit-oriented computers. When you build a quantum computer, you choose the resources, the collection of gates you're going to do for the algorithm you're running, and you're stuck with that. You can't reconfigure it very easily. Sorry about the dog barking in the background. It's probably heard that there's a cat in a box or something. Anyway, so this is a sort of interesting area. So what we came up with, and IBM were in the proposal, and they're working on this, and other people are working on it, is you can exchange, well, you can move quantum state across a network So quantum networking is a perfectly respectable thing for things like quantum key distribution. And if you're aware of that, they're good. If you're not aware of that, look it up, because quantum key distribution demonstrated more than 10 years ago, totally works. And basically, it's based on the idea that you can always observe if somebody observed your key distribution network. And so you can just go on distributing keys until it wasn't observed. And that then you've got a way of doing private key sharing, which is really cool, except it's very limited. It's kind of one hop. But that quantum state that you move around could be compute state. So you can build a parallel quantum computer out of lots of 12-bit quantum computers by essentially doing lots of quantum computing and then classical distributed computing hybrid. And so this looks promising because you can actually afford to build sort of 10, 12, 20, maybe even 50 qubit machines. If you want a pure quantum computer that works really well, you probably need well, 1,000 to get started, but probably 100,000. There's a beautiful talk I was just looking at on YouTube. I can't remember who it was, but a German sounding woman, about why quantum computers will probably never work. And one of the arguments that people have made is that Moore's law will save quantum computing because you'll always be able to kind of make it smaller and faster. And she points out that Moore's law works with silicon because we could get the gates on the silicon smaller and smaller until they were down at the sort of single atom level. The problem with the quantum computer is the qubit already starts at that level. You can't go smaller because that's what the physics nature gives you. So you don't get very large scale integration with quantum computers. It's complete fiction. So there's no way that that kind of acceleration of, the exponentiation of better quantum computers can happen that way. Okay, so enough about that. But squids showed up in science fiction books about 20 years ago. You put a squid on your head and you can read other people's minds, because there are some people that think the human brain may use quantum effects for some of the things it does. That's not disputed. It's debated. Nobody's sure. It could be. It's not impossible. The only quantum effect that's definitely known, interestingly, is the sense of smell. Humans can detect things that could only be detected if there was actually quantum interference happening. And if you're interested in another workable type of quantum, as well as quantum key distribution networks, is quantum sensing is absolutely sensible, perfectly reasonable thing to do. Quantum computers, jury's out, but well, no, the jury's probably going to come back and say guilty, not going to happen. Okay, this is the second thing I'm going to talk about, which is chromatophores. Now, those of you familiar with cephalopods will know that there are all kinds of lovely cephalopods, which include squid and octopi, which are not actually very closely related, except they are in the same kind of family. And they both have the ability to emit ink, which is quite interesting, but they also can consciously change the color of their skin. And in this slide, I'm not sure about copyright on this image. I think I got them off Wikipedia, I'm not certain. I'll check. But you can actually see on the leftmost picture, you can't see something in the middle, you can just about see it on the right, you can actually see the creature, and it's able to camouflage itself by actually copying what's behind it. So it's basically a Harry Potter invisibility cloak, right? It's a working one in nature, it's really there. These things are really amazing. So here was my proposal for what's interesting about this. So we've been working in digital identity systems. Digital identity is really good because you could do accountability in the internet, and you could do all kinds of real true names on social media if you want, if Elon Musk goes completely mad and enforces that, or we all leave Twitter and we go to a new Mastodon, which is wonderful, and then we use true names there for some mad reason. But anyway, you could anyway, so if you want digital ID, you might want to be able to verify your ID. So one way you might verify your ID is by having an ID card or a passport. Very irritating if it gets lost and it's expensive. And you might have an app on a phone. And we designed a system that works on feature phones at the Turing Institute, a project we got funded by the Gates Foundation. You get a $5 phone. You load some magic crypto protocols on it and talk over SMS or even just very low speed net. And then you can get effectively signed credentials, for example, just to say you're over 18, and they can be displayed as a QR code to a verifier. So to a depending agency like a barman who wants to check you are over 18, they can scan the QR code, they can check the signature is valid. You don't need to be on the network at that time, which is very cool. So you can do this offline, you can do it super cheap, that's cool. But you still need a phone, a phone has got to have battery and whatever. And you can store up a number of these with different tokens. So you could have another QR code for voting, and you go to a voting booth saying you're entitled to vote or whatever. But we were thinking, can we get rid of the phone and put this in a person? So what I want to do is two things. You need to do something static and something one time, which is your identity, which is something like your DNA, that's your biometric. And then you need to derive these tokens and display them. So you can derive tokens, and these can change through your life. One of them could be, say, citizenship. Are you, a Icelandic citizen or whatever? So you get that citizenship. And what happens is that somebody gives you a shot of an mRNA vaccine, which then changes your cells to generate some stuff, which changes the QR codes you can show on your forehead or your skin with chromatophores. So first of all, we gene splice, we do some base gene splicing, we put chromatophore cells into humans, and we have to train humans to be able to display stuff consciously. And then they can say, maybe on the hand would be better than on their forehead. So you show on your hand, here's my QR code that entitles me to buy beer, right? And this would be very cool because actually these things are fast and high resolution. So for example, there are a few milliseconds. You can certainly do 24 frames a second. So you can watch movies on your hand. How cool would that be? Right, so this is totally a thing, and of course there couldn't possibly any risk in changing people's genes to include chromatophore cells, enough of neural interfaces to support conscious control of them. But octopi do this for real, and actually people have put chromatophores into rabbits. It's a little bit creepy, and they didn't kill the rabbit. So this is not a completely mad idea, but I don't think we'll see it coming to a pub near you for a while. But anyway, I think this is a lot nicer than putting chips in people. I mean, chips are full of all kinds of dangerous elements and things, whereas this is stuff that from nature, right? So it's nature-inspired computing. Okay, the next thing is not really a cephalopod. I'm cheating, and I'm not going to talk about this because of that, but anyone know what that picture is? It's a data center network topology. And it's called jellyfish, and then this is from a few years back, and I'm not going to go back and remember exactly what year it was, but there are lots of course and cross networks for data centers be massively well studied, and what the fan out should be and what replication level you need and so on. And jellyfish was adding randomness. Now actually the distributed computing networking thing that's interesting about jellyfish is they are not a creature, they're not a single creature. Jellyfish are collectives. So this is actually rather a nice analogy in a data center. In fact, jellyfish are constructed of lots of very small autonomous creatures which get together and form this larger creature. It's very weird, actually. There are other creatures that behave like that, but they're typically complex individuals as well. So if you think of the beehive, any hive insect, insects that work as collectives, ant hills, the beehives, and so on. Those are collective behaviors, but the individuals are also functional as individuals, whereas jellyfish, the individuals are very close to non-functional. They're only just creatures of, they're almost like not quite single cell, but they're very, very simple. But when they collect together, you get things like a Portuguese man of war, which is a really complicated, dangerous looking thing. It's actually dangerous as well. If you do see one, you should get away as fast as possible. And of course, there's all kinds of jellyfish, box jellyfish, and whatever. They're cool. They're mostly annoying because they mostly sting you and occasionally they kill you, which is not great. But data center topology with randomness. Randomness is your friend in lots of networking. Of course, we're all used to random back-off timers in various protocols, so I won't go into that anymore. Oh yeah, this is something I think I might change what I'm sharing here. So this is another networking thing. This is a sort of if Hamed was around, I would say Q Hamed and invasion of privacy with IoT. So let me see if I stop sharing this and I share something else instead, which is this one. See if it works. You all see that. Hopefully you see a different screen. Yeah, okay, so this is my house actually, and I was going to do it live, but it won't work now because the sun's set. But this is my house whenever it was back then. Oh yeah, 3:47. So at 3:47 today, I have solar panels on the roof and they were generating an amazing 20 watts of electricity. That's actually pretty amazing for this time of year and that time of day. I mean, when it was 20 minutes before sunset, and the angle of the sun at this point of the year is very, very low in the sky. And yeah, I'm still getting some electricity. And you can actually see in this picture, there's production on the left side with the solar panels. I'm connected to the grid and I'm getting 300 watts or 320 off the grid. And then I'm consuming 350. The reason it doesn't add up is there's also a massive battery in the roof, which stores electricity. And there's a little algorithm in there which decides how much to store, how much to use, and how much to pull from the grid to optimize my price. And Octopus Energy, in their wisdom, buy electricity from me. Now, at this point in time, I don't have any to sell them. I don't have any spare. But over the summer, I had a shed load to spare. And Octopus Energy run a spot price, which is very cool. According to Miguel, actually, we were talking a bit about this before the London networking dinner. They're currently one of the better prices. You still get a lot less money from them than you pay them for electricity. But given I wasn't using any electricity for the entire summer, in fact, I didn't use any until October, I was selling everything to them. That was quite nice. And by October, I had accumulated, I think, £800 credit. At the moment, I'm using the credit up very fast. But if I get through to February, I'll probably hit zero. So I'll probably net zero, literally net zero, haha. I will have a net zero electricity price. So I've made free electricity for them. They pay me for, I pay them at a much higher rate for electricity, but it balances out and I come out in. So when they put the solar panels in, £7,000 a year ago, he said it will be 5 years to pay back. And then the price went up. And now it's 2.5 years to pay back, which is pretty impressive. And even if the price of electricity goes down, I'm still pretty happy with this. Anyway, so that was the Octopus. I mean, I'm not advertising Octopus Energy, except to say jolly good. Their model is, there are lots of other companies do that model. There are plenty of others out there. Okay, back to the slides. So why is that interesting? Sorry, the reason Octopus, well, any of those models is interesting, of course, is it's a super complex optimization problem. You have some model of the weather and the temperature, for example, in London right now, I think it's about 2 degrees. It's going down to 0 tonight, but on Sunday, Monday, it's going to go up to 12 degrees. Now, depending how much electricity I make and how much I use, I can use that to predict, should I charge my battery and pay for electricity in the daytime, but not at nighttime, you run off the battery, or run off the battery in daytime. Actually depends on the price, right? So I need to look at the predictive model of the spot price and the predictive model of the weather. Not easy. I need to combine those. And it could get one step more complicated. If I had parking outside my house, the install would have included free charging points outside the house of solar charging for cars, for EVs. And that would then be even more complicated because then you want to schedule when you charge a car rather than charging my own house battery. So then the world gets complicated. Now there's lots of work on this, but it's super interesting distributed scheduling problem. Worth a look. Just to say the privacy thing about Hamed, this system's quite funny. That slide I showed of the consumption comes off a web service in China. So the batteries and panels are made in Shenzhen, in China. They make a very significant fraction of solar equipment, PV stuff. And I didn't know that when I bought all the stuff. I just then looked it all up. And they run a service, and all the devices talk to the service over the interweb. And then they do some modeling for you, which is quite neat. But of course, they're leaking, what I'm doing in a house. So that's like my loss of privacy. Not huge. They can't necessarily tell if I'm even in the house, but they can still kind of look at my electricity consumption and so on. I can turn that off. And in fact, they're rather good because the way they connect to the interweb is they put a Wi-Fi and GPRS, you remember 2.5G cellular dongle on the, there's an inverter box next to the battery, and the panels come off as DC, and you need to connect that to the grid with AC and connect it to the, the home network in AC. And that inverter box has got a bunch of controllers on it, and I can change the algorithms if I want to, and I can turn off the Wi-Fi GPRS, or I can just make it direct Wi-Fi only. So only devices in the house can talk to it. So I can use an app on a phone to talk to that. I get the same display, but I don't get the long-term tracking and analysis. I can also get CVS files off it. So, and there are people out there who, for all the different kind of inverter boxes there are, they've written back-end software that will pull the CVS data off these devices, and then you can run your own modeling. And there's lots of free Pythonware out there and machine learning algorithms. And obviously you can write your own thing to talk to the weather system and do that. But it's kind of not really necessary. In a way, the spot price system is actually the best signaling system for how that's going to work. You shouldn't really need anything else. That should be doing the right thing if the market's operating correctly. We know it doesn't, because we know that there are all kinds of thresholds and price setting that's done to keep prices stable. And then there are weird things like, because world events, most EU countries like went and super taxed the energy companies. They were making too much profit, basically warmongering. But that also actually bizarrely helped the UK because that price is set globally, not locally. Anyway, but if there was true spot market and all these things, it might all sort of self-optimize nicely as per sort of Frank Kelly models of the world. Okay, whales, not cephalopods at all, mammals. Anyway, yes, there's this wired story about why the internet is not so new. I wasn't going to talk about that, but I was going to say whales communication. As a communication system, whales are pretty impressive. Whale song can be heard by whales a couple of 1,000 kilometers away undersea. That's really scary. Now, why is that interesting? Well, it's kind of interesting if you wanted to build an undersea monitoring system. What would you be monitoring? Well, if you're sort of the military, you might be monitoring things moving around. And of course, you might use a combination of the whale song and other frequencies to do sonar and detect stuff, which is entirely reasonable. But you might just use it to carry information, or you might even train the whales to sing about stuff. They're pretty smart, we believe. There's a whole Star Trek movie about rescuing whales. I don't know if anyone's seen that, The Voyage Home. It's a great film. It's and aliens show up in 23rd century on Earth and threaten to destroy the Earth because they can't find any intelligent people. And they finally figure out the aliens are speaking whale song, and that they have to go back in time and rescue a couple of whales from the past because there aren't any in the present there. And it does feature some of the Leonard Nimoy doing Spock thing, but he directed the movie as well. Some of the funniest moments in any Star Trek. If you're not a Trekkie, then you'll hate it. But if you are, it's probably was my favorite. Anyway, so yeah, there's a bit with Chekhov trying the Enterprise runs out of fuel, and Chekhov has to break into a aircraft carrier that happens to have nuclear power so they can use it to make more fuel for the Enterprise. But there's this brilliant moment when Chekhov, of course, it has a Russian accent, is asking people, where are there nuclear vessels around here? And everyone's like, what? Russian is asking publicly in the streets of San Francisco for nuclear vessels. Anyway, it's pretty hilarious. And there are many other fine moments. Yeah, there's a bit when Captain Kirk is having a meal with a woman who looks after the last two whales. And he's trying to tell her the truth. And she goes, so you come from outer space? He goes, no, I come from Kansas. I just work in outer space. So that's, I think, rather fine moment of, anyway, it's sort of implausible how quickly she starts believing him. That's the only probably flaw, but then it is Star Trek, right? It's much less bad than Star Wars movies. Sorry, I'm just being generational. Okay, so the next topic, moving along again, actually cetaceans, not cephalopods, sorry, but dolphins, and dolphins and ethics. So what is it about dolphins and whales? Well, they're very smart, and this is a reference to a book by a guy called Leo Szilard. Leo Szilard was a very smart physicist. If you go back in time, you can look him up. He worked on the Manhattan Project. And like Albert Einstein, he very quickly decided that nuclear weapons were probably, nuclear vessels are probably a very bad idea. And that they might be, nuclear would probably be used for bad more than good. And so he joined the gang of people that were trying to do good, and wrote a lot of things about the ethics of physics research, which is something, we caught up with quite recently in computing and networking, writing about the ethics of AI, for example. There seems to be more papers about the ethics of AI than there are papers about AI, which is pretty weird. But anyway, this book, The Voice of the Dolphins and Other Stories, was a collection of short stories by Leo Szilard. He's not a bad writer. I mean, that is a review on Goodreads, which is, I'm not advertising Goodreads, but it's quite a useful place if you want to decide whether to get a book or not. And some of the critics there say he's a bit of a boring writer. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I thought it was quite good. And what he was talking about was the ethics of weaponizing dolphins. So I mentioned, weaponizing whales and using whale song for very ultra low frequency communication undersea and combining it with sonar and so on. But actually in the Second World War, the Americans actually trained dolphins to carry limpet mines and plant them on boats. And dolphins are sufficiently smart, well, we don't even know how smart they are, but they were easily smart enough to tell the difference between different boats. So they were actually able to do this. And Leo Szilard kind of points out that if we don't know how smart they are, they might be smarter than that. We might be, abusing their intelligence. They may not realize what our motives are, or even what the consequence of what they're doing is, because it's stuff on the surface and that's not their world, right? So their entire mindset is completely different. And that's one of the reasons it's hard to model intelligence between different species. And it's a super interesting problem, which I'll get onto in another example in a bit. But anyway, so I think he wisely, in this collection of stories, he gave examples of why this was, inherently a really bad thing to do. By the way, if you're interested in the intelligence of animals and understanding, I don't know if anyone here has been to Kenya, but we adopted an elephant in Kenya. So, obviously they're not as endangered as other creatures, but they do get often orphaned because poachers killed their parents for ivory. It doesn't happen so much anymore because the wildlife safari parks are actually, the rangers have a legal right to shoot poachers because the wildlife is worth more to Kenya than the poachers, which is kind of a bit weird. But anyway, so we have this elephant. So why am I telling this story? Well, the really interesting thing is elephants in Kenya, and I assume this is true anywhere else, but it is a fact that elephants in Kenya can distinguish the different languages spoken. So they can tell the difference between somebody speaking Swahili and somebody speaking Xhosa. I can't say Xhosa properly. Anyway, but there's all these different languages. Why do you care about that if you're an elephant? Well, if you're an elephant and you're walking across Maasai farmland, the Maasai might throw a spear at you because they don't want you trampling on their farmland or their goats or whatever. So the elephants will avoid Maasai. And how do they know they're Maasai? Because they recognize their speech. But it's weirder than that. They avoid men. They don't avoid Maasai women. So they can recognize the gender and language of people. And there's been controlled experiments on that. So how smart is an elephant? Well, in the same ballpark as a dolphin, can do really complex stuff without being taught it. It just learned it on its own. It's pretty amazing, right? So intelligence is a mystifying thing. And I mean, this is super interesting, of course, because now we know this, you can actually use it to steer elephants away from doing trouble so they stay out of harm as well. And there are all kinds of things going on in trying to make sure there are lots of paths for animals in Kenya to move around safely without annoying the farmers who'd have to make money, but staying in the area where there's loads of money being made from tourism. So it's all, can be harmonious. And it's quite interesting kind of ecological design optimization problem, land use, basically. You have to figure out this bit of land is good for farming, this bit of land is good for tourism, and where they can overlap, of course. And then all the different animals have to coexist in an interesting way. It's interesting, the really dangerous lion will run away from a 10-year-old Maasai boy, which is super interesting as well. They just look at them and go, holy shit, no, don't engage with that. Not food. Okay, other things. So it's 6 squid I owe you. No, sorry, it's a very bad joke. There's a real joke there, but I'm not going to tell it because it's not to do with but yeah, so there's another squid. The very first example I gave was the squid, which was a superconducting interference device, which is Josephson junctions. Brian Josephson, Nobel Prize for the Josephson junction. Anyway, Cambridge Nobel Prize, interesting, crazy bit of physics, very strange. Superconducting semiconductor magic. But the other kind of squids I can mention were very commonly used web cache. So everyone knows about web caches and cache for questions. You do a query on the web and your browser is being pointed at by DHCP or IPv6 autoconfig is being handed here's a web cache you can go through, and then somebody nearby recently in space and time asked the same question and it should be present in the cache. Actually, this made me suddenly think, why don't we do a GPT chat-based cache? This is obviously the thing to do. It should be able to take all the things being spoken about on social media in the local area and then work out all the questions that are going to be asked for the next day or so and go, in fact, just construct the answers, that will do fine. I don't know if anyone's on the SIGCOMM channels for their various different places you can look at this stuff, but there's a discussion recently about ChatGPT answering exam questions, but one networking exam questions, but one of the examples is somebody's constructed something that does BGP routing based on GPT-3, and it's not bad. This is quite interesting. You know, something's only been released for a month is better than 20 years of border gateway protocol development. So this is the good thing. AI definitely is, you know, I don't think that's not passing the Turing test. You know, fixing BGP, which was horribly designed in the first place, doesn't make you able to answer interesting questions about T, but it's still useful, which is much more useful than passing the Turing test. Anyway, that was the squid cache, if anyone remembers it. I don't know if it's still around, if the source code has been incorporated in other caching systems. The original web caches, of course, were just built into the original HTTP daemon from CERN. So that was a cache. I don't know, most people didn't turn it on for a while, but it actually ran as a cache very easily, and you just locally config all your client browsers manually, because it wasn't sort of built, people didn't know about the web for the first 3 weeks, 3 years or whatever. But then you just made your HTTP cache stuff, and then everyone querying it just like DNS caching, it would just go off, and then it had to add the getF modified synth stuff to HTTP and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's that kind of squid. And then this is other squid, which I was looking for other squid. I was running out of squid questions and answers, but this is another squid, which one of the PhD students in the computer lab said, I think there was a thing called squid, which was an evil thing that captured passwords in Wi-Fi hotspots and cafes. So yes, there is. There it is. There's a thing that if you're foolish enough to be typing your real password in plain text rather than using HTTPS or whatever, then there was a thing that people deployed in cafes, and then would, you know, Wireshark their way into your accounts and so on, and compromise. So if you're still using passwords and not using Kerberos keys and SSH or whatever it is people use, or VPNing around the world. So that was another squid, the Wi-Fi squid. So I better speed up, or we'll be out of time. It won't be time for questions, which is probably a good thing, because there's no answers I could possibly give about any of this. Okay, so this is one of the best books I ever read, and I think on science. It's a beautiful book. There are lots of beautiful books on science, but this is up there. And it's called Other Minds. It's about the evolution of intelligence in octopi. So octopi are very, very intelligent. It's super interesting. They're much more intelligent than squid. There's no doubt about it. Octopi probably up there with elephants and dolphins or cetaceans. And what's really interesting, though, is modeling their intelligence, because it's even worse than trying to think of how an animal with no limbs for manipulating the world, like a dolphin or a whale, reasons about things. It's really hard to think your way through that. It's hard enough to think of why on earth a cat sits on the keyboard of your laptop, you know, let alone, you know, why the whale sings the way it does. But octopi, of course, have 8 limbs, and their intelligence is distributed. They actually have non-trivial nervous systems in their limbs. So you're probably all aware that when you learn a task physically, your hand-eye and brain coordination actually starts to write programs so that you can send strings of commands to your limbs. So when you learn a musical instrument, you can do things you could not consciously have a feedback loop between your hand and your brain to do that thing on an instrument, because it takes too long. It's really, really slow. So what happens, your brain constructs a sequence of things and just fires them one after the other, roughly. I'm very simplifying very badly. Octopi came up with a better solution. They evolved a better solution, which is they literally do local processing in tentacles. This is like completely incredible. So, and you can experiment on this in empirical studies of octopi capturing fish. They can literally, you'll see a tentacle move faster than it could possibly have got a nervous signal from a tentacle back to the brain was out to the tentacle. The fish doesn't stand a chance, because the fish is just a routine centralized brain, which is also stupid, but that's a separate problem for the fish. But it does have, you know, good reactions and so on. It can turn fast, but the octopus can do conscious stuff, but remote, which is like, you know, that's amazing. And it's not clear how much they can do, but they can also change colors when they're communicating with other octopi. They use this visual communication directly. I was mentioning chromatophores they have conscious control of, and they use that as part of their communication. and we can't decode it. It's too hard. It's like, you know, yet. I mean, clearly somebody's going to fire up a foundation AI on it any minute now and figure it out. Or, you know, DeepMind will do, you know, what would it be, alpha squid or something. But right now, this is very hard to understand. So this book is basically a really beautiful book by somebody who's been doing decades of study of octopi. And, you know, it's a lovely book because he sort of obviously loves them. They're not very lovable, actually. I mean, they're quite nice tasting. But I prefer squid to octopi as a flavor, but you know, it's a minor difference. But if you go to Spain, they do some really great dishes with octopi and ink, and they cook rice in the ink, which is really nice. And that's kind of a nice trick. Sorry, for vegetarians here, that's not great. And particularly worrying about their intelligence, perhaps we should think about them in the same category as we shouldn't be killing the whales and the dolphins, certainly not the elephants, and definitely not bear. Actually, bear are, you know, grizzly bears are, you know, are very smart too. So they're pretty clever. So it's, if that's a criterion you use for not eating something, then this probably should be on the list. But yeah, so basically they do this incredibly complicated, highly dynamic distributed computing, and that's really interesting. And people have actually tried to model it, and there was some work in biologically inspired computing, which actually took, literally grew artificial bits of octopus neural net to try and see if you could use it. And this is a little bit of an outrageous reach. I mean, that doesn't involve a real live octopus. I mean, it involves extracting bits of DNA and then constructing this stuff, which is, you know, quite interesting. So a bit like putting chromatophores into humans, you know, artificially constructing stuff out of octopus DNA to build distributed computers might be interesting. I suspect they're going to be too slow for an interesting and too big macro scale, because cells in animals are huge compared with silicon transistors, whatever. But they might be good at robots. You know, you can have hybrid cybernetic organisms, cyborgs rather than robots, I guess is the right phrase if you're into the correct branch of sci-fi. So yeah, maybe it could be fun. And then the other thing, of course, I mentioned, you know, that they have this control, which somehow they can observe something behind them. Octopus are incredibly flexible, so they can change their shape and their volume, absolutely extraordinary extent. But presumably they turn their head around, they look at what's behind, and somehow they use that to camouflage themselves. So they create this Harry Potter invisibility cloak effect. I actually tried to do this with Helen Oliver, who was a PhD student in Turing and Cambridge, and we couldn't afford it in the end, but she got hold of some color e-ink material that the Japanese company have made, and I'm surprised you can't buy this yet. But basically, we worked out it would cost about $10,000 to buy a couple of square meters. And it's quite high resolution, like, you know, the e-ink on a Kindle is about 300 dpi, I think, roughly. So if you went at a 300 dots per inch display with a couple of meters, and then you put a camera behind you and you put this thing in front of you and you just show exactly what's behind you, then for at least one person in front of you, you could disguise yourself as what's behind you effectively. Of course, you could also do really clever stuff if you morph the shape of the cloak, the way an octopus can change its shape. That would be interesting, but very hard. But the octopus just does it, which is kind of interesting. Camouflage is also interesting, and I'm actually, this is an appeal to anyone out there who wants to look at this. I have a master's student who's just starting his project, looking at how to do censorship avoidance using now most people would do this using kind of, well, it depends where you are in the world, but you can do VPNs, but VPNs can be detected because they can be fingerprinted. Also, the VPN service sites tend to be advertised somewhere, and so people that want to block things just keep accumulating lists of those and putting them into their firewall rules, right? And you can do other things like Tor, and, you know, Tor is not perfect. You also need cover traffic. What we're looking at is a significant fraction of browsers, well, browsers support Quick, and Quick has a proxy called a mask, which is a multiplexing proxy for Quick traffic. And that allows you, even within one Quick session, you have multiplexing. You can do some really cool things with multiplexing. They're changing the multiplexes, so you get really good cover traffic. And in fact, the Apple Air 2 relays, I think, sorry, 2 hot relays, I think use something like that. But Apple in their wisdom has decided to list all the sites of their relays. So the Great Firewall of China just blocks all of those. So you don't get privacy, but and you don't get to do censorship avoidance using that. But you could imagine building this into something else in some nice way, perhaps with the help of Brave or somebody. But what we're actually interested in is anyone's interested in measuring this kind of stuff, because we might want to deploy a few things this guy will build, and we want to compare with HTTP proxies that do clever stuff with HTTPS mixes, mixed nets and so on. So that's sort of camouflage ideas in a networking way. So getting back to networking again. Oh yeah, and I think this is the last cephalopod sea snails, or whatever they're called. And I tried to look up something to do with sea snails. I couldn't find any really good example of a sea snail, except for the Will You Snail story, which is basically somebody's using AIs to give you adversaries in online games, which has been around forever. I mean, game AI is like predates DeepMind, right? I mean, it's like 20 years ago. The Xbox Formula One game, a really long time ago, had it. You could race AIs, and the AIs were trained on real racing driver, real Formula One driver data. So Microsoft did a thing where they sat down with a bunch of the Formula One, they instrument Formula One, which is heavily instrumented weather. So you go to McLaren, you go to whoever, you've got this incredible stream of data coming off of the cars, and you're driving, you can tell exactly what the driver's doing. And then you integrate that into training your AI, and then your driver, you can choose to, who do you want to race, very cool. Okay, so that's all my examples, except the last one, which is another bit of Greek. The Greeks are going to go, no, you've got this wrong. Sorry, apologies. But this is the thing which I remember when I was a kid, I got really confused when I was in Greece. So the people kept saying calamera, and I was like, why are you asking me or telling me about squid every morning? So you can guess what calamera then calamera means, which is not the same as calamari, which is what you get when they deep fry the squid in batter and put it with some like lemon and or whatever you want. And that's a dish known all over the Mediterranean, probably other parts of the world, but not the same as calimera, which is good morning, which it isn't, of course, except the other side of the planet right now. And that is the end of the talk. So you've got 7 minutes for questions.
Actually, you've got 12 minutes for questions, so one per cephalopod, I guess. And well, the snail is also, if you forget the snail is a gastropod, so fitting end to Christmas dinner, I guess, or Christmas talk. Okay, questions. Open the floor for questions. I'm curious to hear about your spot pricing, John. Do you actually get spot pricing? Does Octopus give you spot pricing? I heard you say something to that effect. I didn't realize that we had spot pricing here already.
Yeah. So Octopus passed through a version of the spot price that they pay, but it's obviously factored way down. And the argument they use, and a lot of the electricity companies use, is that they need to recover some money from that, because it costs them to upgrade the grid to have electricity uploaded from houses, because the grid was designed as a one-way distribution network, and very much like the telephone networks, right? The telephone network didn't support high bandwidth out of the house, and in fact a lot, until you put symmetric bandwidth on fiber instead of copper. So the power grid was designed to get power into houses and not much out. So that's their argument, but they do actually give a spot price. You have a choice when you sign up to the sell-in tariff that these companies have. You can choose, a long-term rate or a spot price. So I just went for the spot price, and you can look it up, and there's tables of this stuff. It's all public. The various companies that do this tend to be competing slightly for niche customers that are interested in renewable supply companies. So Octopus does another thing which is quite interesting, which is they incentivize you to reduce your demand from them by giving you free electricity if the peak period of the day that they're experiencing trouble with demand, if you can move your demand away from there. So it's like it's like off-peak pricing, but it's done dynamically. So you get notifications saying if you cut your electricity by X% below your normal use between 5 and 7 in the evening on this day, then we won't charge you for what you do use. And that's kind of another interesting incentive trick. And the reason they're doing that, of course, is partly it's green. I'm not going to say greenwashing, that's not fair, but they want to make sure that they're maximizing the amount that they buy only renewable sources, which is sort of probably in the long run a good thing. And you save money, so it's like, well, it's a win-win. But it is a market position they're taking, and a lot of customers probably don't care, or maybe they do now. Maybe just something that incents you to save money is a good thing. So you can feed that into your algorithm, whether you decide to run off battery, obviously. So you can time shift the batteries I've got. I mean, it's boring detail. The batteries I've got take basically about 8 hours of 4 kilowatt production from the roof. In summer, I can get about 6 hours back from the battery, which is pretty good. And they've got about a 10-year life. So maybe. Well, lifetime in all these technologies is funny. The solar panels have 20-year life, and those two things that's how long they last till they go to 80% of their capacity, the original capacity. But yeah, I'm getting an actual spot price. And then like when Miguel was looking at this in the Edinburgh Castle, he pointed a list of the ranking of companies and the different prices they're offering, which are basically amount to what it's costing them to upgrade their infrastructures to offer by or sell in tariff. You don't get any tax breaks anymore. There used to be some government subsidy for this stuff, both for the tariff and for the install, actually, but those have gone away. The only thing they did have was a VAT holiday on solar panels for a while, which was annoying because I missed that by a week, which was not paying VAT on that would have been quite a big saving.
Yeah.
Well, John, it was brilliant as usual. Listening to your thought stream is like drinking water from a hose. So I'm just wondering how many of these can be turned into papers and projects, or failed papers and successful projects. So I really like your octopi story, and both camouflage and intelligence. So is it just an outcome of the books you've been reading recently, or are you really planning to go to animal studies and study animal intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things is the distributed intelligence in a flexible creature really changes how you think about robots. So I was a couple of years ago, at the beginning of lockdown, I started trying to build a robot hand with a Raspberry Pi controller and some very simple actuators, and it was kind of doable. But then I quickly discovered that the state of the art work is a lot of it is now moving in far more into using non-rigid structures and mimicking biology a lot more. And I think that's going to be much more successful. And I think the people that do, sort of bioengineering-y things are going to really make headway there. I think in the long run, if you could build a robot to doing exploration, had anything like the capability of an octopus, it would just be way better than anything you see in R2D2 land, which are just like sad, sad things, or even sophisticated androids that look like humans. This will be far more capable than anything humans could do. And I think it will also have benefits in a similar way that robotics has had quite a big payoff in prosthetics for people that had loss of limb or whatever. But actually going through a biological line would obviously be more useful, directly applicable potentially to some kind of interesting replacements that were more naturalistic in their movements, for example. So I don't know if you've seen, but there are various people out there who've built open source 3D printable artificial hands, because they were very expensive if you try to buy them on the market, and they built some very nice stuff which is affordable, but there's still these rigid structures. And if you think about how flexible biological stuff is, then the extreme point, if you ever see a movie of an octopus squeezing through a very small hole, it makes even cats going through a cat flap look clumsy. They're just incredible level of dexterity which is really cool. And then this distributed intelligence is obviously part of that, because they need to be able to control things faster and far away somehow. And that seems to be a rather unusual thing. The other way people do that kind of thing, obviously, is by building lots of separate robots. It's more like a jellyfish, where you have you create a swarm of small robots, and they collectively behave in a certain way, which is also, I think, a biologically inspired, sensible approach that's super interesting. And people have built some pretty cool demos of those things as well. And I think when I look at those sorts of things, they're much more interesting. Although the Boston Dynamics type robots are pretty impressive, they're really examples of very heavy lifting of control theory to make them stable, which is impressive, but they're still kind of rigid structures that are mimicking something that's quite an old-fashioned way of doing things. So I like the bio-inspired stuff. But I really recommend that book if you like reading sort of science books in your spare time. It's kind of quite exciting. I mean, there are loads of books like that, but that was one of my top reads.
And closed networking, you're thinking about some new paradigms of like tentacle computing?
Yeah, even if it's just a source of names for projects, that could be useful.
Yeah, well, I've benefited from your book recommendations over the years. So actually recently I managed to pass some of them. So these recommendations actually live over the years. So
cool.
Any other questions? See, Aaron says octopi sounds like something already. Maybe someone's actually working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw this. It's like a dish. So
It's a dish. Okay. Yeah. What you can't build, just make it into a dish. Nice. Okay. Any final questions?
Hi. Yeah, I do have a question. Firstly, really nice presentation. Although it was quite informal, but it was really nice and quite like I've kind of learned a lot of things. So I have just one curiosity. What do you think? What are your thoughts on zero-shot learning in terms of networks and distributed learning? Like it's like a trade-off. For example, when the learning mechanisms are distributed, obviously some latency and other constraints are there. And how do you see like combining them with zero-shot learning?
That's a really good question. In general, I have a problem with the zero or few shot learning at some level, because the way they succeed is by having extremely large training sets. So and that means that they're not really sustainable in some senses. So what OpenAI and people have done is doesn't really make sense in terms of the energy cost. But actually, when you're saying applying it to networking and distributed, it could be a really good idea to look at. I just literally, you just asked it. It's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. It might be a really good approach, because it's a little bit like some of these systems. We did one bit of work, which I guess is sort of similar, where my PhD student, Cecilia Mascolo, my student, Andreas Gramenos, worked in this distributed PCA, where we had lots of low-end devices, and we wanted to calibrate. We wanted to learn a model of the sensor accuracy and calibration, and we needed to do it with a very short window of data in every device, because you just couldn't keep a lot of data, and you didn't want to send all the data over the network. You just wanted to do not federated learning. Actually, it was kind of federated. It could be, but more peer-to-peer. But that was just doing PCA, just doing principal component analysis. It wasn't learning a kind of general model. It was just trying to say, what are the key things that, just a few moments of the distribution, really. So that sort of suggests what you're suggesting is a much more general idea. It's very cool. Yeah, so somebody should go.
Like some kind of a reinforcement learning kind of technique with like partial data sets or something, since we don't have a lot of data sets in a sense of networks, and obviously we don't have it like on a large scale or maybe finer granularity. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that sounds like a good thing to think about till next year, and and then get some money to do it, or find a PhD student to work on it, or maybe a master's student actually initially or something. That sounds like a promising line of work. But in general, when you look at the few shot systems that are used, and they end up with this huge centralized system that's been trained on 350 billion parameters, trained on, it's almost like overfit, but it's on so much data that it's got coverage, but it has no internal model. It's just a really good example generator, which is kind of weird, but that kind of approach might be really good for example, fault diagnosis and networking, maybe. I don't know, but performance diagnosis. I mean, I don't have to go away and think about it. That's a good thing. I will stop mumbling and hand back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that brings us to the top of the hour. So thanks, John, for the amazing 12 cephalopods of Christmas lecture. And happy holidays, and have a great new year.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
And you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.